Welcome to the Get Published podcast, sponsored by Brodie Consulting Group. To get more information about our coaching, publishing, executive ghostwriting, and podcast production services, go to getpublishedpodcast.com. Hello, I am Paul Brodie, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Get Published podcast, where we help authors get published with a proven system that works. Today, we're being joined by Michael Pope, author of Wicked Northern Virginia. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Are you ready to get started?
I was born ready, Paul.
Oh, I like to hear that. Let's get going then. Question number 1. What is the one piece of advice that you would give to a first-time author who is currently writing their book?
One of the interesting things about being a writer is that it actually requires being a little bit of an introvert and a little bit of an extrovert. And what I mean by that is the extroverted part of it is really important to gather information and talk to people and maybe even talk to publishers or do interviews for your book. So there's a social part of collecting information. And then you've got this pile of paper that you need to turn into a book or a project. And so you need to sit down in front of your computer by yourself for hours on end, and that's all introverted behavior. So there's this really interesting sort of line that very successful writers and authors have where they are actually a little bit of an introvert and also a little bit of an extrovert. It's key to sort of finding where that line is in your own life. Another piece of advice I would have has to do with collecting information. One thing that I really enjoy the researching part of it way more than the writing part of it. And so there's two pieces of advice for researching for your listeners. One is reach into your wallet right now and find your local library card. Everybody has a local library card. What you might not know about your local library card is that it opens up online databases that will be invaluable. So spend some time on the website of your local library and type in your library card, and you will see databases that are not available to the general public that will be useful in your research. The other thing is, this is a trick that I've learned from doing genealogy. One of my hobbies is genealogy. And so if there's someone that I'm researching about and someone I'm writing about from maybe 100 years ago, 200 years ago, I will do their genealogy and find out where their parents came from and census records that show where they've lived and maybe what their profession is. And those genealogical tricks and tools are, as it turns out, invaluable for piecing together bits and pieces of people that I'm not related to, but I do their genealogy as if I were related to them. And I find out all kinds of details about their lives that I can use in my books.
And what do you feel is the hardest part about getting published?
One of the biggest headaches I have about getting published was the images, the photographs, getting the rights to the images, paying for images. There was one image that was in my second book that was done. It was a watercolor image by an artist who was of some fame because he, at one point in his career, created Smokey the Bear. And so he's since deceased, but his family is fiercely protective of his artwork because of the legacy. And so they really liked the project I was working on. It was a local project that this artist had done a watercolor of, and they really wanted me to use it, but they also were protective of his legacy, so they wanted to charge a lot of money for it. Well, my publisher is really great, but one thing they do not do is make money available for images. So I had to shell out of my own pocket to use this watercolor image, which was very important to the book, and so I was willing to take the hit and spend the money, but I didn't like doing that. And another thing on the images is that my publisher was frequently, well, they've got standards for images. You know, they want it to be a certain image quality. And there was one image that I actually paid for some archive, a lower dollar amount than this other watercolor that I was talking about. But I paid for this image nonetheless. And my publisher refused to use it because they said the quality, like the sort of DPI, whatever quality standard that they were using, it didn't meet their quality standard. But at another point in the book, they actually used a photograph that I had taken from my iPhone. So if I had this all to do over again, I would have printed out that image that I got that I wanted to use on a piece of paper and taken a photograph of it with my iPhone, and then it would have met their image standards. And so if I had to do that, the whole thing all over again, I would have approached that image part of the book a little differently.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. The first thing that popped to my head was DPI, and they probably wanted at least a 300 DPI on that because I've had that issue with some of my books where it has to be of that certain quality or else it doesn't come out right.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what it was. It was a 300 DPI was the issue, and for whatever reason, the this image that I got from an archive. I mean, this is an archival image. It didn't meet that specification for whatever reason, but my iPhone photos did. So again, if I had all this to do over again, I would have literally printed out a really nice quality version of it, taken a photo of it with my iPhone, and then it would have met the 300 DPI standard.
Well, let's talk a little bit about marketing. So please share a marketing strategy that you have used in your book launch that worked well.
So I had actual book launches that were essentially parties. Well, the first one was more of a party, and then the rest of them were events where I would give a speech and then sign books and sell them. In terms of marketing, one thing that I'm fortunate to work with a publisher, so they do a lot of the sort of nuts and bolts marketing. For example, they got my book into the local Costco. I never had to call Costco because that was something they did. This is one of the benefits of working with a publisher is they do a lot of that sort of work. One of the keys on that, though, the downside to working with a publisher is they take most of the money, right? So they take the big risk of printing the book and paying for it, and if it doesn't sell, it's they have taken the hit. So they end up taking most of the money. That's the downside. The real place where you make money, and I didn't realize this until I got into the business, is if you buy books at a deep discount from your publisher, then you've got the book and you can sell it at face value. So the real place where you make money is going to events, going to having book signings, and I give a lot of speeches. In fact, this is one of the things I really enjoy giving speeches, so it's not like work for me. But like recently, I was at the Army-Navy Country Club in Arlington, Virginia, and I was speaking there. And that was a great group. I sold like 20 books. And I gave a speech with a PowerPoint presentation with some images from my books, the ones that were accepted, that is. And so this is something I didn't quite realize until I was sort of already in this game, is that the money that you make from books that sell on Amazon or in bookstores, the few bookstores that are left in America, that's really small. That's a very small percentage of the money that I get as an author. Where I really make my money is doing events, giving speeches, doing book signings, opportunities where I get to sell my books, my stockpile of books that I bought at a deep discount from my publisher, because I then sell them at face value. And that's where the real money comes in, is the events that I do.
Well, in regards to the traditional publisher that you use, do you mind sharing the name of the company?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's History Press. They are based in in South Carolina, and they do books all over the country. So they have a number of different imprints. In fact, I've written 4 books, and they've all been for History Press. And so, like the first book I did was called Ghosts of Alexandria. That's for an imprint they have called Haunted America. So you can get like Haunted Charlotte, or they've got these books about ghosts and haunted for all up and down the East Coast, and I think all over America. And they have another imprint that's like True Crime. That was my third book, was in the True Crime series, where I talked about a prosecutor that shut down brothels and illegal casinos in Arlington, Virginia. And then they have this other imprint that's Wicked. That's my latest book, Wicked Northern Virginia. If you Google History Press and Wicked, you'll see there's all kinds of, Wicked New York, Wicked Washington, D.C. They're all over the country. So the publisher is great, and it's really wonderful to work with them. They've kind of let you do what you want to do in terms of putting your book together. They do have some very strict requirements for their images, though.
Cool. I really appreciate you sharing that, because one thing that I thought was really interesting is the fact that they got your book into a local Costco. How did that work?
Again, I was not involved in that at all. I got a text from someone that I work with that said, "Hey, there's a stack of books here in the local Costco." I thought that was great. And I get somewhat frequently the folks at History Press the marketing people at History Press will send me an email that said, "Hey, the folks at Barnes and Noble want to do a book signing," And I'm not. I mean, I always say yes to book events. I've never once turned down a book event. But I wasn't involved in getting my books into the Barnes and Noble. I wasn't involved in getting my books into the Costco. I know that there's a growing trend of people self-publishing, and I think that's great. But this is the downside to self-publishing, is that you're the person. If you want to get your book into Costco, that's on your shoulders. Whereas working with an actual, old sort of more traditional publisher, they get me into the Barnes and Noble. They get me into the Costco. I'm not involved in that. And they've got relationships because they've got other of their titles in the Costcos all across the country. So I wasn't involved in that at all.
Yeah, that's one of the benefits of traditional publishers is the fact that they can help with that distribution. But yeah, that's really cool that they had it in local Costco. Now, was this actually an area that they had just for local authors, or was it just part of all the books that they have?
No, it's just part of all the books they had. In fact, I did a book signing at one of my local Costcos, and it was just in a, you know what, actually, now that I think about it, it was in kind of a table that had local books, but that might have been arranged that way for the book signing. I'm not exactly sure how they had that section set up on a normal day. I think it might have been sort of in with all of the other books, although I'm sure they sort of grouped the local books together.
Yeah, I've been a Costco member for probably close to 20 years now, so I'm always in there, always notice where they have their books. I was just really curious about that because that definitely is a cool thing to have a local author and have his book there with all the other books that are out there. That's really cool.
So going back to that, I was talking earlier about doing events, and that's where you make your money, selling your own books. That's true. When I give speeches, I'm always selling my own books. But when I do sort of in-store book events, most of the time, not always, most of the time, I'm selling their books, not my books. So like the Costco book signing that I did, I was not selling any of my books. I was selling the Costco books. So as much fun as I had doing that, and as much as I appreciated doing that, I didn't walk away from that Costco book signing with any extra revenue. You see what I'm saying? So Costco might have sold more books, but I get such a small percentage, very small percentage, on the books that Costco sells versus the books that I sell.
Right.
So that's not to knock doing the Costco event. I would never have turned it down, but it's not like it was a huge moneymaker for me.
Gotcha. It's more exposure, basically.
Right, exactly.
Well, let's talk about your favorite book. So what is your favorite book, and what was the number one thing that you learned from it?
Well, this is a trick question because I've got many favorite books.
It is.
But I gave some thought to this. And there is an excellent book called Master of the Senate that was written by Robert Caro in 2002. And this is part of a 5-part series that Caro has done about the life of Lyndon Johnson. So the first 2 installments were written in 1982 and 1990, respectively. So this 2002 book is some years into this project, and he's talking about the Lyndon Johnson's time in the U.S. Senate, which was fascinating for many reasons. A couple lessons learned here is the way that Johnson was sort of the scheming opportunist, while also being kind of a progressive visionary. He was also a scheming opportunist. And so you get to see the mixture there. So, for example, when he really wanted to do something, he would get people into one of these Senate hideaways, these hidden rooms that are all throughout the Capitol building. And he would essentially get the other senators drunk. He would serve up, his favorite drink was scotch, and he would drink Cutty Sark. And he would make a round of drinks. But here's the Lyndon Johnson secret. He would make everybody else's drink really strong, and he would make his drink really weak. So as the meeting grew on, he was in a room full of a bunch of drunk senators, and he was the one that had his wits about him, and he could sort of make them do what he wanted to do. The real lesson, though, that came out of this book, this is fascinating, is that people think about red baiting and going after people's communist affiliations. They associate all that with Joe McCarthy, which is fair, which is true. I mean, he certainly did that. But the Master of the Senate points out that Lyndon Johnson created that tactic long before McCarthy ever used it. And so there's a very detailed chronology in this book about a government employee that was brought before this Senate committee that Johnson was on. And Johnson had done some research and found out that way back when this guy was in college, like in the 1920s, that he was a member of some sort of communist club or something like that. And he used it to go after this individual, not because the individual had done anything wrong, not because the individual actually Johnson had anything against or even wanted to get him out of his job, but he just wanted the sort of political benefit of looking like he was tough on communism. Well, it destroyed this guy's career, destroyed this guy's life, sadly. I mean, it's a really sad story from the person he was attacking. But from Johnson's perspective, he got the sort of political benefit of being so virulently anti-communist. Again, the scheming opportunist, Lyndon Johnson. So this was one of the big lessons that I still remember. I read this book way back when it came out in 2002, but this is one thing that has stuck with me since the book came out, is that Johnson essentially created red baiting, and Johnson created everything we think of that was created by Joe McCarthy. That was all the creation of Lyndon Baines Johnson.
And for a final question, what is your favorite quote and why?
So again, a thought-provoking question. One of my favorite quotes I think about all the time is a Thomas Jefferson quote, which is essentially, "The earth belongs to the living." The actual quote from Jefferson, which is from 1789, "The earth belongs in usufruct to the living." Usufruct is not a common word, but it essentially means temporarily, or during your lifetime. So the earth belongs to the living means it's our world, and we should not be sort of tied to things, ideas, and rules, and the environment that was created by people 200 years ago. So you think about the Constitution as a really great example of this. Are we tied to the thoughts from 200 years ago, to the reasons they created the rules that they did? Or does the earth belong to the living? Does the earth belong to us and not a bunch of people who died 200 years ago? According to Thomas Jefferson, it's our world, and we should not be tied to all of these things, ideas, and prejudices of people who lived 200 years ago.
Well, Michael, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show. What is the best way for people to find you online?
The best way is Twitter, Michael Lee Pope.
Well, Michael, I want to thank you once again for being on the show, and I wish you all the best in your author journey ahead.
Thank you so much. It's been fun.
Thanks again for joining us today. To learn more about how you can be featured in our brand new Get Published business book, go to getpublishedpodcast.com.